There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in quietly, wearing the comfortable clothes of a Tuesday night. And only much later, when you trace the map of your own heart, do you see that this quiet, unassuming moment was, in fact, the continental divide. It was the point where the entire landscape of your future shifted, where all the rivers of your life changed their course and began flowing toward a new, uncharted ocean. For me, that moment smelled of old books and the faint, clean scent of Julian's shampoo. It was the weight of his head on my shoulder, a pressure so profound and so terrifyingly fragile that I held my breath for what felt like an eternity, convinced that even the smallest exhalation might shatter the universe we had accidentally created on my worn-out sofa. He was asleep. It was a simple, biological fact, yet it felt like a sacred pronouncement. His breathing had deepened into the slow, rhythmic cadence of true rest, a gentle tide pulling in and out against the shore of my collarbone. The low light from the street lamp outside my window filtered through the thin curtains, casting long, distorted shadows across the room and painting a silver filigree on the sharp line of his jaw. In this half-light, he looked younger, the perpetual tension he carried in his brow smoothed away, the guarded set of his mouth softened into something vulnerable. I was a photographer by trade and by nature, an observer who lived behind a lens, cataloging the world in frames of light and shadow. But this was a composition I could never capture on film. It was a living, breathing photograph that existed only in the delicate ecosystem of that singular moment, felt through the points of contact between us. The warmth of his temple against my neck, the slight displacement of fabric where his arm rested against mine, the almost imperceptible weight of his hand loosely curled on the cushion just beside my leg. My entire world had contracted to the small, warm geography of his presence. I was acutely aware of the frantic, bird-like flutter of my own pulse, a frantic counter-rhythm to the steady bass of his slumber. I sat perfectly still, a statue carved from equal parts reverence and fear. Fear that he would wake up and pull away, the space between us rushing back in like a vacuum, cold and vast. Fear that he would realize the intimacy of the position and recoil, erecting the polite walls of friendship that we had, until recently, so carefully maintained. And beneath that fear, a deeper, more treacherous current of hope was pulling at me, a yearning so potent it was a physical ache in my chest. I wanted to stay in this moment forever, to live inside this quiet, unexamined closeness where nothing had to be named or defined. He was just Julian, my friend, asleep on my shoulder. And I was just Leo, the man who had been silently in love with him for 2 years, pretending this was nothing more than the comfortable, accidental intimacy of two people who knew each other well. But it wasn't. It was everything. And in the profound stillness of my small apartment, I knew, with a certainty that was both a comfort and a terror, that nothing would ever be the same again. We had met at a midnight bus stop, a cliché so perfectly cinematic that I would have dismissed it as lazy writing in any other context but my own life. A sudden, violent summer downpour had ambushed the city, turning the streets into glittering black rivers and the air thick with the smell of ozone and wet asphalt. I was returning from a long shoot, my camera bag clutched protectively to my chest, my clothes soaked through, my hair plastered to my forehead. I was miserable, tired, and counting the seconds until I could be home. And then he appeared, jogging under the meager shelter of the bus stop's awning, laughing to himself as he shook the water from his dark hair like a dog. He wasn't laughing with joy, but with the wry, defeated humor of someone who has just endured the final insult of a very long day. Our eyes met, and a spark of shared commiseration passed between us. "Guess the universe decided we weren't wet enough," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone that seemed to cut through the percussive drumming of the rain. I managed a weak smile. "I think the universe and I have different definitions of enough," that was it. That was the beginning. A simple exchange between two strangers seeking refuge from the same storm. We learned that we were both waiting for the 14A, that we lived in the same sprawling, slightly neglected apartment building on the west side of town, and that we both worked jobs that seemed intent on consuming our lives whole. He was Julian, a software engineer who spoke about code with a frustrated passion that I, an artist, found surprisingly relatable. I was Leo, a freelance photographer who spent my days trying to find the extraordinary in the mundane. The bus arrived, a behemoth of light and warmth cutting through the downpour, and we sat together, our damp clothes creating a small, humid atmosphere around us. The conversation flowed with an ease that was startling. It wasn't sparkling or witty, it was better than that. It was comfortable, a low-stakes exchange of life details and quiet observations that felt like slipping into a well-worn sweater. By the time we were walking down the linoleum-tiled hallway of our building's third floor, it felt less like I had met a stranger and more like I had reconnected with a friend I hadn't seen in years. Our friendship unfurled from that point with a natural, unhurried grace. It was a friendship born of proximity and circumstance, but nurtured by a genuine affinity. It was built in the small hours, in the shared exhaustion of our demanding careers. It was pizza on my floor when his fridge was empty and he'd worked a 14-hour day. It was me borrowing his toolkit to fix my perpetually leaking sink, and him asking me to look at the user interface for a new app he was designing. Valuing my aesthetic eye, we were two solitary vessels that had found a quiet harbor in each other's company. He was more outgoing, with a constellation of friends and colleagues that orbited his life, but I sensed a deep, abiding loneliness in him, a restlessness that his easy smile couldn't quite conceal. It was a frequency I recognized because it hummed inside my own chest. For a long time, he had a girlfriend, Sarah. She was a peripheral character in the story of our friendship, a name mentioned in passing, a reason he was sometimes unavailable. I met her a few times. She was perfectly nice, perfectly fine, and perfectly wrong for him, a fact I observed with the detached clarity of a third party. Their relationship seemed to exist on a different plane, one of polite distance and scheduled appearances. When he spoke of her, it was with a kind of weary affection, the tone one might use for a long-term obligation rather than a passionate partnership. Her existence was, for me, a kind of safety net. It allowed me to categorize my growing feelings for Julian as a theoretical problem, a hypothetical ache. My love for him could exist safely in the quiet, unlit corners of my mind because there was a very real, very tangible barrier preventing it from ever needing to see the light of day. It was a secret I kept with the same care I gave my camera lenses, polished and protected, taken out only in private. I began to photograph him, though he rarely knew it. Not in a creepy, hidden way, but in the casual, ambient manner of a photographer who always sees the world in potential frames. I caught the way the morning light would hit the side of his face as he laughed at something on his phone, the intense focus in his eyes as he tried to explain a complex piece of code to me, the slump of his shoulders when he came home, defeated by a project. My hard drives filled with these stolen moments, a silent, secret gallery dedicated to the man who had become the quiet epicenter of my life. I told myself it was just practice, a study in portraiture. It was a lie, of course, but it was a necessary one. It was the architecture I built around my feelings to keep them contained, to prevent them from spilling over and flooding the comfortable, precious foundation of our friendship. I valued what we had too much to risk it. He was my anchor in a life that often felt transient and uncertain. To risk that for a feeling he almost certainly did not share felt like a form of self-destruction I was unwilling to entertain. The shift began, as so many shifts do, not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible dissolution. His breakup with Sarah was an event I learned about after the fact. There was no dramatic announcement, no tearful confession. He simply mentioned one evening, while we were watching an old black-and-white film, that she had moved out. He said it with the same flat, informational tone he might use to report the weather. There was no storm, just a slow, gray drizzle of an ending to a relationship that had been overcast for a long time. But the absence of drama did not mean the absence of impact. A fundamental support structure in his life, however flimsy, had been removed, and he was left standing in the empty space it had occupied. He didn't seem heartbroken so much as unmoored. He was a ship that had slipped its anchor, drifting in a silent, featureless sea. His own apartment, now half empty and echoing with the ghost of a shared life, became a place he actively avoided. And so, he started to gravitate toward mine. My small, cluttered one-bedroom space, with its stacks of photography books and the perpetual scent of darkroom chemicals, became his default destination after work. It started innocuously. He'd text from the elevator, ordering Thai, want anything, or he'd appear at my door, holding a six-pack of beer, with a tired smile and a simple, "Got a minute?" I never said no. The truth was, his presence was a balm for my own solitude. Having him there, filling the quiet corners of my apartment with his energy, his sighs, his low laughter, was a quiet joy I allowed myself to indulge in. The lines of our friendship, once so clearly delineated, began to blur at the edges. The easy companionship deepened into a kind of unspoken codependency. We fell into a domestic rhythm that felt both natural and dangerously intimate. He started leaving a change of clothes in my closet, a toothbrush in my bathroom. We weren't living together, not officially, but most nights, we were together. He was seeking refuge, a safe harbor from the emptiness of his new life, and I, willingly, and with a heart full of treacherous hope, provided it. I told myself I was just being a good friend. It was another lie, another carefully constructed wall to hide behind. I was falling deeper into the quiet gravity of his orbit, and I was doing absolutely nothing to stop it. I was simply observing the change, documenting it in the catalog of my memory, and wondering, with a persistent, anxious hum, where it was all leading. And then the ritual began. It started on a Thursday, I remember, because I had just finished a grueling 2-day wedding shoot, and my entire body ached with a fatigue that felt bone-deep. Julian was over, sprawled on the opposite end of my sofa, nursing a beer while I complained about the bride's demanding mother. We had put on some mindless action movie, the kind with lots of explosions and very little plot, as background noise for our conversation. At some point, the conversation tapered off, and we both just watched the screen, lulled by the flickering light and the low rumble of the sound system. I must have drifted for a moment, because when I became fully present again, I noticed the sound of his breathing had changed. It had deepened, evened out. I glanced over. His head was slumped against the back of the couch, his chin tilted toward his chest, the beer bottle held loosely in his hand. He had fallen asleep. A wave of something incredibly tender washed over me. It was such a simple, unguarded act. To fall asleep in someone's presence is a profound gesture of trust. It's a surrender. I watched him for a few minutes, the way his chest rose and fell, the way his eyelashes cast small shadows on his cheeks. Carefully, so as not to wake him, I leaned over and gently pried the bottle from his fingers, placing it on the coaster on the floor. I dimmed the television and found a light blanket in the hall closet, draping it over him. He stirred, a soft mumble escaping his lips, but didn't wake. I retreated to my bedroom that night with a strange, humming energy in my veins. It was the first time he had shown that level of vulnerability with me, and it felt significant. The next time it happened, a week or so later, he was closer. He had propped his feet up on the coffee table and leaned back, his head resting on the arm of the sofa near where I was sitting. Again, the slow descent into sleep, the subtle shift in his posture as his body relaxed completely. This time, I didn't move. I just sat there, listening to the quiet sounds of the apartment, hyper-aware of his proximity. The space between us was charged, a magnetic field I was terrified and thrilled to be inside. It felt like a secret I was keeping for both of us. The morning after these nights, he would wake up on the couch, slightly disoriented, and offer a sheepish, "Sorry," crashed again. He never lingered on it. He'd make coffee, we'd talk about the day ahead, and the unspoken intimacy of the night before would be packed away, unacknowledged. Slowly, incrementally, the ritual escalated. The distance between us on the couch began to shrink. One night, he fell asleep with his head on a throw pillow that was pressed against my leg. I could feel the warmth of him through my jeans, a low, steady heat that seemed to travel up my entire side. My body went rigid, every nerve ending firing. I spent 2 hours like that, unmoving, my own muscles cramping, just so I wouldn't disturb him. I studied the patterns of the grain in the wooden floor, counted the books on my shelves, did anything to distract myself from the overwhelming reality of his head resting against my thigh. It was a sweet, unbearable torture. I was his place of rest, his sanctuary, and it was a role I cherished more than anything. But I was also just a piece of furniture to him in those moments, a convenient and warm place to land. The ambiguity was tearing me apart. The first time his head landed on my shoulder, it felt like an accident. He had been leaning back, his eyes closing, and as he drifted off, his head lolled to the side, coming to rest in the curve of my neck and shoulder. My breath hitched. He was so close I could feel the soft tickle of his hair against my skin, smell the faint, lingering scent of his cologne mixed with the simple, clean smell that was uniquely his. He shifted slightly in his sleep, a soft sigh escaping him, and settled more firmly against me. It wasn't an accident anymore. It was a choice his unconscious body had made. He had sought me out for comfort. This became the new normal, the final stage of the ritual. Nearly every night he was over, we would end up like this, me sitting ramrod straight, a living statue, and him asleep against me, his body relaxed and trusting. My apartment became a liminal space, a zone governed by a set of unwritten rules. In the daylight hours, we were friends, easy and platonic. But at night, on that couch, in the soft glow of the television, we were something else entirely, something undefined and fragile. I became an expert in the geography of his sleep. I knew the subtle shift in his breathing that signaled his descent from light dozing into deep slumber. I knew the way his fingers would sometimes twitch, or the way he would mumble a word fragment from a dream. I lived a double life. Outwardly, I was Leo, his dependable friend. Inwardly, I was a man drowning in a sea of unspoken feelings, analyzing every sigh, every small movement, for a sign, a clue, a hint that this meant as much to him as it did to me. I wondered if he was even aware of what he was doing. Was it a conscious act of seeking intimacy, veiled in the plausible deniability of sleep? Or was I truly just a comfort object, a human pillow he used to soothe the loneliness that haunted him? The not knowing was a constant, low-grade anxiety. My bedroom door was always open, a silent invitation to a more definitive form of closeness. But it was a threshold he never crossed. The couch was our territory. It was safe. It was ambiguous. It was a space where he could receive all the comfort of intimacy without ever having to acknowledge it, and I could give it without ever having to risk a confession. We were trapped in this beautiful, agonizing stasis, and while a part of me desperately wanted to break it, another, larger part was terrified of what would happen if the spell was broken. So I continued to sit, night after night, with the weight of him against me, the weight of my love for him a heavy, hopeful stone in my chest. The night everything changed started just like any other. It was a cold, rainy Tuesday in late autumn. The kind of night that makes the world feel smaller, drawing you inward. Julian had come over straight from work, looking frayed at the edges. A big project was nearing its deadline, and he'd been pulling brutally long hours. He barely spoke when he came in, just dropped his bag by the door, shed his damp coat, and collapsed onto the couch with a groan that seemed to come from his soul. I made us ramen, the cheap, instant kind we both secretly loved, and we ate in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the clinking of our chopsticks against the bowls and the steady drumming of rain against the window pane. Afterward, we settled into our usual positions on the couch. I put on an old, slow-paced foreign film with subtitles, something that required little emotional investment. I expected him to be asleep within minutes. His exhaustion was palpable, a heavy cloak draped over his shoulders. But he didn't fall asleep. The movie played on, its quiet, melancholic scenes filling the room, and he remained awake, his head resting in its familiar place on my shoulder, his body still but not slack with sleep. His breathing was too controlled, too conscious. I could feel the subtle tension in his frame, a low-level hum of wakefulness. My own body was a tightly coiled spring of anticipation. The usual script had been abandoned, and I had no idea what the new lines were. The air between us felt thick, heavy with all the things we had never said. The silence wasn't comfortable anymore. It was charged, electric. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, pretending to read subtitles that my brain wasn't processing, intensely aware of the warmth of his cheek against my neck. I could feel his gaze on me, even though I wasn't looking. He was studying my profile, I was sure of it. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one a small eternity. The movie ended. The credits began to roll, a silent cascade of white text on a black screen. The apartment was plunged into a profound quiet, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle hiss of the rain outside. I still didn't move. I didn't dare. It felt like we were balanced on a knife's edge, and the slightest movement could send us tumbling. He shifted then, a small, deliberate movement. He lifted his head from my shoulder. The sudden absence of his weight was a shock, a cold patch of air where his warmth had been. I finally turned to look at him. In the dim, silvery light from the window, his face was an open book of emotions I had never seen him display before. There was exhaustion, yes, but underneath it was a deep, heart-wrenching vulnerability. And something else. A question. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper, a rough, hesitant sound that seemed to catch in his throat. Leo. I couldn't form a word. I just made a small sound of acknowledgement, a low hum to let him know I was listening. He looked down at his hands, which were clenched in his lap. Can I ask you something stupid? My voice finally returned, just as quiet as his. Always he took a deep breath, a shaky, uncertain thing. He met my eyes again, and the raw need I saw there stole the air from my lungs. Would it be okay, he began, his voice dropping even lower, if I stayed here tonight? In your bed. It was the crossing of a threshold, but not the one I had been expecting. It wasn't a confession of love or a sudden kiss. It was a request. A question born of a need so deep it had finally broken through his defenses. He wasn't asking for sex. He was asking for sanctuary. He was asking to finally cross the symbolic line between the ambiguous safety of the couch and the undeniable intimacy of my bed. He was asking to be let all the way in. Yes, I said. The word was small, but it felt momentous, a key turning in a lock I didn't even know was there. Of course, getting up from the couch felt like moving through water. We didn't speak as we moved down the short hallway to my bedroom. I was hyper-aware of everything. The soft scuff of his socked feet on the hardwood floor, the way he hesitated in the doorway, as if seeking final permission. I pulled back the covers on my bed, a simple, domestic gesture that felt loaded with 1,000 unspoken meanings. He slipped under the sheets on one side, and I on the other. The space between us and the bed felt miles wide, a vast, uncharted territory. We lay on our backs, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, not touching. The tension in the room was a living thing, a third presence between us. After a long, silent minute, he turned onto his side to face me. I mirrored the movement, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. In the near darkness, I could just make out the shape of his face, the gleam of his eyes. I think I'm messing this all up, he whispered, his voice thick with self-recrimination. You're not, I whispered back, the words of fierce, protective reassurance. You're not messing anything up. He was quiet for another long moment, and then he asked the real question, the one that had been hiding beneath all the others. Leo, he breathed, his voice fragile. Can I kiss you? Time stopped. The rain, the refrigerator, the entire city outside my window seemed to fall silent, holding its breath. This was it. The precipice. The moment where everything could change or everything could break. My answer was not a word, but an action. I closed the small distance between us, and my lips met his. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was tentative, soft, a question and an answer all at once. It was a kiss of profound relief, of arrival after a long and uncertain journey. It tasted of salt and fear and a hope so overwhelming it felt like coming home. It was a confession made in the dark, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that had been living between us on that couch for months. And in that moment, I knew the ritual was finally over. A new one was about to begin. I woke to the pale, gray light of morning filtering into my room. For a disoriented second, I was confused by the unfamiliar warmth at my back, the weight of an arm draped loosely over my waist. Then, the memories of the night before came flooding back, a tidal wave of warmth and adrenaline. Julian. He was here, in my bed. A slow, incredulous smile spread across my face. I lay perfectly still, savoring the feeling of his body pressed against mine, the soft, even sound of his breathing near my ear. It felt real. It felt solid. After months of living in the ambiguous fog of our couch ritual, this felt like solid ground. It felt like a beginning. I closed my eyes, wanting to commit every detail of the moment to memory. When I finally, carefully, turned over, the other side of the bed was empty. The sheets were cool to the touch. He was gone. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach, instantly extinguishing the morning's warmth. I sat up, my eyes scanning the room. His clothes from the night before were gone. His shoes were gone from the hallway. A quick glance into the living room confirmed it. The couch was empty, the blanket folded neatly on the arm. It was as if he had never been here at all. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my fingers fumbling with a sudden tremor. There was one new message. From him. My heart leaped with a desperate, foolish hope. The message read, "Morning. Had to get to work early for a meeting. Sorry to sneak out. Coffee soon." That was it. Coffee soon. The two words were a punch to the gut. They were so casual, so friendly, so utterly devoid of the monumental intimacy we had shared just hours before. It was the kind of text a friend sends a friend. It was a retreat. A full-scale, tactical withdrawal back to the safe, platonic territory we had supposedly left behind. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the darkness of my room now withered under the harsh, clinical light of his message. I felt like an idiot, a naive, hopeful fool who had completely misread everything. The kiss, the vulnerability, his head on my pillow. Had it all been a dream? Or worse, had it been a moment of weakness for him? A temporary lapse in judgment that he was now desperately trying to undo? The following days were a special kind of hell. A quiet, agonizing torture of silence. My sure, let me know when reply to his text went unanswered. A day later, I sent a tentative, "Hope the project is going well." Hours passed before a reply came back, swamped. Talk later, but later never came. The constant, low-level hum of communication that had been the background music of our friendship was gone. My phone, once a source of connection to him, became a symbol of his absence, a silent, mocking rectangle of glass. I checked it obsessively, my stomach twisting with each notification that wasn't from him. My apartment, once our shared sanctuary, felt cavernous and hostile. Every corner held a memory of him. The couch was the worst. It was no longer a piece of furniture, but a monument to my own foolishness, a stage where I had allowed myself to hope for something that was clearly never real. I couldn't even look at it without feeling a fresh wave of humiliation and grief. The silence was deafening. It was heavier, more profound than any silence we had ever shared before, because this one was not comfortable or companionable. It was a deliberate, suffocating void. He was in the same building, just a few doors down the hall, but he might as well have been on another continent. I found myself timing my entries and exits, terrified of an awkward encounter in the hallway or the elevator. After a week of this radio silence, something inside me broke. The pain and confusion curdled into a hard, cold knot of resolve. I couldn't live in this limbo anymore. I deserved an explanation. I deserved more than a ghosting and a casual, dismissive text message. I didn't know what I would say, but I knew I had to do something. The not knowing was eating me alive. That evening, I was coming back from a grocery run when I saw him down the hall, fumbling with his keys at his apartment door. My heart leaped into my throat. It was now or never. I walked toward him, my footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. He heard me and looked up, his eyes widening in a brief flash of panic before his expression settled into a carefully neutral mask. "Hey," he said, his voice strained, unnaturally bright. "How's it going?" I stopped a few feet from him, my grocery bag digging into my palm. I couldn't play this game. I couldn't pretend. "Talk to me, Julian," I said. My voice came out lower and shakier than I intended. "Please, just tell me what happened." He flinched, as if my words were a physical blow. He looked away, focusing intently on the lock of his door. "I've just been really busy, Leo. The deadline is killing me." It was such a weak, transparent excuse. It was an insult. "No," I said, my voice gaining a bit of strength. "That's not it. Don't do that. Don't lie to me. We went from that night to nothing. You disappeared." I deserved to know why. He finally looked at me, and the mask crumbled. The raw, panicked vulnerability I had seen in my bedroom was back, tenfold. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked utterly lost. "I can't do this in the hallway," he whispered, his eyes darting around as if the beige, featureless walls had ears. "Then let me in," I said, my voice softening slightly at the sight of his distress. "Or come to my place. But we need to talk." He hesitated for a long moment, a war playing out across his features. Finally, he gave a short, jerky nod and pushed his door open, holding it for me to enter. His apartment was Spartan, filled with boxes he still hadn't unpacked since Sarah left. It felt like a temporary space, a waiting room. He didn't turn on any lights. We just stood in the dim twilight filtering through his window. "I'm sorry," he said, his back to me. "Leo, I am so sorry. I've been a coward." I waited, letting the silence hang in the air, giving him the space to continue. He finally turned around, and his eyes were glistening. "I freaked out," he said, his voice cracking. That night was the most real thing I've felt in. I don't even know how long. Years, maybe. And it terrified me." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure agitation. "Everything with Sarah? It was easy because it wasn't real. Not really. We were just going through the motions. But with you, the way I feel when I'm with you, it's not easy. It's important. And that's terrifying." He took a shaky breath. I've never felt this way about a guy before. I don't know what it means. I don't know what I'm doing. And our friendship is the best thing in my life, Leo. The absolute best thing. The thought of ruining it, of messing it up because I'm confused and scared, I couldn't handle it. So I ran. I thought if I just put some distance between us, I could figure it all out in my head. But it just made it worse. The silence was a million times worse than the confusion. His confession washed over me, a complex wave of relief, empathy, and a lingering ache of hurt. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified. He wasn't dismissing what we had shared. He was overwhelmed by it. All the scenarios I had built in my head, where I was a fool or an object of convenience, they all collapsed. The truth was far more complicated and far more human. He was just as lost in this as I was. I closed the distance between us, stopping just in front of him. "You could have just told me that," I said, my voice gentle. "You could have just told me you were scared." A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I didn't want you to see how messed up I am, Julian," I said, and I reached out, my hand cupping his jaw, my thumb gently wiping away the tear. "I've always seen you." And with that, the dam broke. He let out a choked sob and collapsed against me, burying his face in my shoulder, his arms wrapping tightly around my waist. I held him, my own eyes burning, stroking his hair as he shuddered against me. We stood there for a long time in the dim light of his empty apartment, two lost people finally finding their way back to each other. The conflict wasn't over, but the silence was. And in its place, we had found a fragile, messy, and terrifyingly beautiful truth. That conversation in the hallway, followed by the raw honesty in his half-lit apartment, became our new foundation. It was a foundation built not on comfortable silence and ambiguity, but on the bedrock of a shared, acknowledged vulnerability. We didn't solve everything in that one evening. His confusion didn't magically vanish, and my hurt didn't instantly heal. But we had made a choice. We chose to face the uncertainty together instead of separately. We agreed to move forward slowly, deliberately, with a promise of absolute honesty, no matter how awkward or frightening. It was a pact to replace assumption with conversation. The days that followed were a gentle recalibration of our entire relationship. The dynamic shifted from the unspoken to the spoken. The change was most visible in the small, everyday moments. The first time he came over to my apartment after our talk, there was a palpable nervousness in the air. We sat on the couch, a careful foot of space between us, both hyper-aware of the furniture's loaded history. It was Julian who broke the tension. He looked at the empty space between us, then at me, and said, with a small, self-deprecating smile, "This is weird, isn't it?" I laughed, a real, relieved laugh. "Incredibly weird," I admitted. He smiled back, and then, with a deliberate slowness that was a statement in itself, he shifted closer and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was a conscious choice, made in the light, with no plausible deniability. His hand was warm and solid in mine, an anchor. We watched a whole movie like that, our hands clasped together, a silent declaration that this was our new reality. The domestic intimacy that had once been accidental now became intentional. He still kept clothes at my place, but now he asked, "Is it okay if I leave this here?" His toothbrush in my bathroom was no longer a sign of convenient proximity, but a small symbol of permanence. We started cooking together, navigating the small space of my kitchen in a clumsy but happy dance. We talked. We really talked, about everything and nothing. He told me about the pressures at his job, the complex dynamics with his family. I told him about my fears as an artist, my struggle to find my voice. We were mapping the uncharted territories of each other's inner worlds, territories we had only glimpsed before. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing. I walked into the kitchen to find Julian standing at my counter, wearing one of my old t-shirts, carefully pouring hot water over coffee grounds in my pour-over cone. He looked up and gave me a soft, sleepy smile that made my chest ache with affection. "Morning," he said. "Thought you could use this." He had learned my morning coffee ritual, a small detail that felt more intimate than the kiss itself. It was an act of care, of paying attention. It was him saying, "I see you. I'm learning you." We drank our coffee sitting at my small kitchen table, the early morning sun streaming through the window, and it felt like the most natural, peaceful moment of my life. This was our new normal, a quiet, gentle rhythm of shared lives. The ultimate symbol of our new beginning came a few weeks later. We were getting ready for bed in my room. The couch had been tacitly retired as our place of intimacy. Now, my bed was our space, a place of conversation and quiet closeness. As I was turning off the lights, he walked over to the bedroom door, which I always left ajar out of habit. He paused, his hand on the knob, and looked back at me. Then, with a quiet click, he closed it completely, shutting out the rest of the apartment, the rest of the world. The gesture was so simple, so profound. The open door had always been a symbol of our transience, of his potential exit, a sign that our intimacy was temporary and conditional. The closed door was a statement. It was a declaration of privacy, of permanence. It said, "This room is ours. We are in this together." It was the creation of a boundary around us, a sacred space for what we were building. Lying in the dark next to him that night, his arm once again draped over me, I felt a sense of peace so deep it was almost overwhelming. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for months was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. The journey had been fraught with fear and misunderstanding, a long walk through a fog of ambiguity. But we had found our way through it. We had navigated the treacherous waters of unspoken feelings and emerged on the other side, not unscathed, but stronger and more honest. I think back sometimes to that first moment, his head on my shoulder on that old, worn-out sofa. I remember the terror and the hope, the feeling that the universe was holding its breath. It was a continental divide, a quiet moment that changed everything. But the real change, the real foundation, was built later, in the messy, difficult, and beautiful work of learning to speak the truth. Home, I've realized, is not a place with four walls and a roof. It isn't a couch or a bed. It's the profound, unshakable feeling of being seen and accepted for exactly who you are. It's a safe harbor you build with another person, through trust and patience, and the quiet courage to close the door and face the future together. We met in a storm, Julian and I, two strangers at a midnight bus stop. And in the end, we learned how to be each other's shelter. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd finally learned how to create together.